Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a shocking discovery, Mrs. Nghia's name was used to approve a large transfer of charity money on the exact day she was unconscious in the hospital. So, who really signed it, and what else was done in her name while she couldn't protect herself? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. The morning had come in gently, the way mornings do in the mountains, slowly, softly, without announcement. Mist was still wrapped around the tea fields when Tu Tieu unlocked the front door of her small tea house and set the first pot to warm. It belonged to no one but her and the quiet. Her first customer of the day was Mr. Bin, an elder from the village up the hill who came every Thursday without fail. He never asked for anything complicated, just the pale green tea, 2 cups, and a few minutes of stillness before the day pulled him back into its current. Tu Tieu always poured without being asked. She had learned, working at this tea house, that kindness didn't always need words. Sometimes it was just a warm cup, set gently in front of someone who needed it. She was refilling his second cup when her phone buzzed against the wooden table. She recognized Yuri's name immediately and felt the small, familiar warmth she always felt when she saw it. But when she answered, something in his voice made her set the teapot down carefully. "Something ugly is spreading," he said. "About my mother." Tu Tieu excused herself from Mr. Bin with a soft smile and stepped to the doorway where the morning mist was just beginning to lift. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," Yuri said quietly, "that I needed to hear your voice first." She leaned against the doorframe and listened. A rumor had appeared overnight. She wasn't sure yet if it had come through the office group chat, an anonymous message, or someone whispering in the right ears at the wrong moment. It didn't matter how it had arrived. What mattered was what it said. That Mrs. Nghia had misused the company's charitable donation fund. That money meant for workers' families, for community aid, had been moved without proper approval. That the numbers didn't match. Tu Tieu was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If they attack her goodness, we answer with proof and calm." Yuri exhaled slowly on the other end. "I knew you'd say something like that. Is it true?" she asked. Not because she doubted Mrs. Nghia, but because Tu Tieu always believed in asking the honest question first. Yuri said, "But it's designed to look true, and that's almost worse." By mid-morning, the rumor had moved through the company office the way smoke moves through a room low, invisible until you noticed it everywhere. Phones buzzed. Conversations paused when someone walked past. A printed screenshot had appeared on the break room table, though no one admitted to putting it there. The message showed specific numbers, dates, amounts that matched the donation fund exactly. Whoever had written it knew exactly how to make something feel official. The staff reacted the way people always do when charity is involved, with emotion first. Questions second. Donations were sacred. If the company had raised money for workers' children's school supplies, for a family in the village who had lost their home, and that money had been taken, people felt it personally. Nghia heard the whispers from her office. She sat with her hands folded on the desk and her teacup untouched in front of her. She had learned, over many years, that the first moments of a crisis are not the time to speak. They are the time to listen, to understand the shape of what you are facing before you decide how to face it. Her eyes showed pain. Yes, but she kept her posture straight and her expression composed, because she knew that composure, in a moment like this, was its own kind of answer. Lynn appeared in the hallway outside, moving between clusters of staff with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years learning how to make influence feel like comfort. She placed her hand on a colleague's arm. She nodded with a look of troubled concern. She said the things that sounded right. "We need to be careful, and I'm sure there's an explanation. And the most important thing right now is to protect the company." When she suggested an internal review, she framed it as protection. When she proposed that, Mrs. Nghia stepped back from any public-facing role until the matter was resolved. She said it gently, the way a concerned colleague might. She even said, "I want to support her through this." But when Mrs. Nghia appeared in the doorway of her own office and asked, calmly and directly, "Who posted this? What account? Can you show me the original source?" Lynn's expression shifted. Just briefly, a tightening around the eyes, a fraction of a second where the careful warmth slipped. Nghia looked at her steadily. "Then we wait until we have it," she said. "I will not respond to something I cannot see clearly." Alone in her office afterward, Mrs. Nghia allowed herself a moment of something softer. She looked at the framed photograph on her desk, a community event from 3 years ago. A bright afternoon in the village square, children carrying new school bags. She had organized that donation herself, had counted every receipt, had stood in that square and watched the children's faces, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the company she had helped build was good for something beyond buildings and contracts. She picked up her phone and called Uri, not to complain, and not to ask him to fight, just to say what she needed him to hear. "Protect the truth," she told him, "not my pride. If the records are honest, the records will speak. I don't need to shout." Uri was quiet on the other end. She continued, "They want me to look guilty by being loud. I will be quiet and correct." There was a pause. Then Uri said, "I'll start with the finance records this afternoon." "Good," Mrs. Nghia said. And then, more softly, "And Uri, don't forget to eat something. You always forget when things get heavy." Uri gave a small, quiet laugh. It was the kind of laugh that holds more than humor, relief, love, a little grief. "I won't forget," he said. She set the phone down and looked at the photograph again for one more moment. Then she straightened in her chair, picked up her pen, and went back to work. Because that was what she had always done. Not because she wasn't hurting, but because she had decided long ago that dignity was something you chose every morning, in every small action before the world had a chance to take it from you. Uri went to the finance department that afternoon. He asked for the donation fund records, every receipt, every approval, every bank statement tied to the charity account over the past 3 years. The staff member who had the filing key looked at him with uncertain eyes. She was young, and she had seen enough of the past few months to know that being helpful to the wrong person could become dangerous. He spoke to her the way he always spoke when someone was frightened, quietly, without urgency, with the patient tone of someone who understood that trust had to be offered before it could be accepted. "No blame," he said. "Just documents. You're not choosing a side. You're just giving me paper." They went through the records together, page by page. Most of it was clean, organized, dated, signed correctly, with matching bank confirmations. Mrs. Nghia had been careful, that much was clear. But then Uri noticed something that didn't fit. A transaction with a description that read simply, "Community support." No event name, no attached recipient letter, a vague label in a file where every other entry was specific. He photographed it quietly and said nothing yet. There was more to find. Back at the tea house, the afternoon light had turned warm and amber by the time Tu Tieu spread her folders across the low table beside the window. She had gathered what she could from memory and from the small community she had come to know through years of quiet presence in this part of the mountains. She remembered the events. She remembered seeing Mrs. Nghia at the school supply handout, remembered the medical aid week when the company had sent a nurse and supplies to 2 villages without asking for anything in return. She called the community leader who had organized the school event. He remembered clearly. He even had a letter of thanks, signed and dated, that he had sent to the company afterward, and he was willing to send a copy. She called the clinic coordinator from the medical aid week. Same answer. Clear records. Honest gratitude. Tu Tieu organized everything the way she organized everything at the tea house, patiently, without rushing, letting the order emerge naturally. She labeled each sheet: date, amount, recipient, confirmation. She set them side by side, stacked them neatly. She had no dramatic discovery to announce. She had something quieter and more useful. Clean proof, built slowly, by someone with steady hands. She worked beside a warm teapot, breathing slowly. The afternoon was quiet. Outside, the mist was beginning to return to the mountains. When the last letter was labeled and the last folder closed, Tu Tieu sat back in her chair and looked at the neat stack in front of her. Nghia, about the woman she had come to know slowly, through small moments. The way she always asked about Tu Tieu's health before asking about any news. The way she had once quietly slipped a warm scarf onto Tu Tieu's shoulders during a cold evening visit, without saying a word about it. Mrs. Nghia was not a woman who asked to be loved. She simply lived in a way that made love feel natural and deserved. And the idea that someone was trying to use her greatest generosity, her genuine care for workers' families, for village children, for people who had nothing to do with boardrooms or contracts, as a weapon against her, made Tu Tieu feel something she rarely allowed herself to feel: anger. She set her hand on the stack of folders and made a private promise to the still afternoon air. We will not let this stand. At the company, Lin had grown less patient. She arrived at a small meeting with Mr. Tuan and two board-adjacent staff and proposed that the company issue a public statement acknowledging questions about internal fund management and committing to a full review. The language was carefully chosen, nothing explicit, nothing that named Mrs. Nghia directly. But the implication was clear, and once a statement like that was released, the story would write itself. Mr. Tuan nodded along. He was good at nodding along. He had learned, over many years of working alongside people like Lin, that agreeing early was a way of avoiding the harder conversations. When the draft statement was brought to Mrs. Nghia for her signature, she read it once. Then she set it on the desk and pushed it gently back across. "I won't sign anything that implies guilt before evidence," she said. Lin's composure held for a moment. Then, just at the edges, it didn't. "Do you want the company to collapse?" she said, her voice losing the careful warmth it had carried all morning. Mrs. Nghia looked at her. "I want the truth to stand," she said simply. "Those are not the same thing." Uri, standing at the edge of the room, said nothing. He felt the pressure of the moment, the way you feel the pressure before a storm, a tightening in the air, a sense of something building. But he stayed calm. He had learned from his mother, over many years, that calm was not the absence of feeling, it was a decision. After Lin left the room, Mr. Tuan lingered for a moment near the doorway. He looked at Uri with an expression that was difficult to read, not quite guilt, not quite warning, somewhere uncomfortable in between. He opened his mouth as if he might say something. Then he closed it, glanced once more toward the hallway where Lin had disappeared, and walked out without a word. Uri watched him go and filed that moment away carefully. A man who almost speaks is a man who knows something he hasn't yet decided to share. He would come back to that. That evening, Tu Tieu sat under the warm lamp in the corner of the tea house, the folders organized beside her. Her phone rang, and she answered before the second ring. "I found clean receipts," she told Uri. Community letters, confirmation from the clinic coordinator and the school contact. Dates, amounts, names, all of it matches. She heard Uri exhale a long, slow breath that told her more than words could. "You bring order to my fear," he said quietly. Tu Tieu smiled, though he couldn't see it. "We'll give it all to Mrs. Nghia in the morning," she said, neat and respectful. "She'll know what to do with it." Sometimes that was enough, just the sound of someone you trusted. Breathing steadily on the other side, Tu Tieu looked out at the dark tea fields through the window, the mist barely visible under the night sky. They were simply present, night after night, steady and warm, like a lamp that never went out. The evidence package came together the next morning in Mrs. Nghyia's office. Tu Tieu's community letters, Uri's finance records, receipts that matched, approvals that were dated and countersigned. Line by line, the donation history told a story that was honest and clear. Mrs. Nghia reviewed each page without hurrying. Uri sat across from her and cross-checked the bank statements one more time while she read. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of paper turning. Most of it was exactly what they had hoped. Clean, consistent, documented. And then Uri stopped. He turned a page back, read it again, compared the date against a separate document in the folder. His expression shifted not dramatically, but enough that Mrs. Nghia looked up. "What is it?" she asked. Uri set the bank statement on the desk and turned it so she could see. He pointed to a single line, a transfer, significant in amount, tied to the donation account. The date on the approval record showed her name, her authorization. But the date was one that neither of them had looked at carefully until this moment. Mrs. Nghia stared at it. The color in her face changed very slowly, like something draining away. Tu Tieu, listening on the phone from the tea house, heard the silence stretch and felt a cold, quiet fear settle in her chest. "That date," Uri said, his voice careful and steady. "You were in the hospital that day." "Mrs. Nghia didn't answer immediately. She looked at the document again, as if looking long enough might change what it said, as if the numbers and the date and her own name printed neatly in the approval line might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. They sat on the page exactly as they were, clear, damning, and impossible. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was not even conscious that day." The three of them held the weight of that sentence together, Uri, in the quiet office, Tu Tieu beneath the warm lamp far away, and Mrs. Nghia sitting very still in front of a document that carried her name on a day she had no memory of. Uri looked at the approval line one more time. The authorization was digital, a code, a signature stamp, the kind of access that required a password, or a trusted login, or someone who had been given permission they were never supposed to use. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. Someone had waited for the one moment when Mrs. Nghia could not watch, could not speak, could not stop them, and had moved money in her name as easily as turning a key in an open door. Tu Tieu's voice came through the phone, soft and careful. "Uri, if they did this once while she was in the hospital, we have to ask what else they may have done. What other documents? What other approvals?" Uri nodded slowly, though she couldn't see him. "I know," he said. Mrs. Nghia set both hands flat on the desk. Her eyes were dry, her back was straight. But something in her expression had changed, not broken, not defeated, but deeply, quietly certain. The kind of certainty that comes not from confidence, but from finally understanding exactly what you are dealing with. "Find everything," she said. "Every document, every date, every signature that carries my name." She paused. "And then we will know the full shape of what was done to us." Someone had moved donation money while Mrs. Nghia lay in a hospital bed. Someone had found a way to put her name on an approval she had never given, and whatever else they had signed in her name, whatever other doors they had opened while she was unable to stop them, that was still waiting, somewhere in a filing cabinet or a digital record or a quiet corner of the company's history. To be found, a dangerous rumor spreads through the company overnight. Someone claims Mrs. Nghia misused the charitable donation fund, money meant for workers' families and village children. The accusation is designed to look real, with specific numbers and dates. Lin moves quickly, playing the role of concerned colleague while quietly pushing to remove Mrs. Nghia from her position. But Mrs. Nghia refuses to sign any statement that implies guilt, and Yuri begins quietly tracing the donation records. Meanwhile, Tu Tieu gathers clean receipts and confirmation letters from the community, proof that Mrs. Ngia's charity work was honest and well documented. Then Uri discovers something that changes everything. A large transfer was approved under Mrs. Ngia's name on the exact day she was hospitalized and unconscious. Someone had access to her credentials and used them when she was completely helpless. But who? And what else did they sign in her name?